Well, hello everyone. Good to see you. Thank you for reading along with me today. Today's reading is from Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, and we are finishing up Jesus' Sermon on the Mount today. Sermon that started back in Matthew chapter 5, and we had a video on that chapter and what Jesus was doing there, and we focused particularly there in verses 17 through 20 about what Jesus was trying to do in this sermon. This was a kingdom sermon, and he was talking to the people about what they must do if they would be his kingdom citizens. Do you remember in Matthew chapter 5 when Jesus was setting forth the contrasts between the traditions of the Pharisees and what they were teaching the people and what he would say to the people? You have heard that it was said to those of old, but I say to you. And Jesus would draw that great contrast. We're going to come back to that when we get to the end of chapter 7. But let's begin reading chapter 7 and verse 1. Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. I want to stop right there for just a moment and make a few observations about this business of not judging. Matthew 7 and verse 1 might be one of the most abused passages in all of Scripture. Don't judge me, people say. And we look at their behavior, we look at their actions, or we look at their speech, listen to their speech, and we know that it's not right. And that's not a judgment that we make as if we were the standard of right and wrong. It's a judgment that we make based upon what God has said in His Word, because He is the standard of right and wrong. But people who don't want to be told what they're doing is wrong, they will say, well, you can't judge me. I think it's interesting that this very passage, this very text, does not say what people often want it to say. Did you notice that what Jesus says here, when he says, do not judge, he gives a qualifier to that, doesn't he? In verse 2, he talks about the standard of judgment. And so this statement in chapter 7 and verse 1, do not judge, it is not an unqualified statement. It's a statement that must be understood with the context that surrounds it. Jesus talks about the standard of measurement that we would use to judge someone. And so what he's really saying here is, do not judge others with a standard that you yourself would not want to be judged by. Don't be overly critical in your judgment. Don't have an impossible standard that you use to judge the words, the actions, or the motives of others. Because if you yourself were subject to that same standard, you probably wouldn't fare any better. And so the people who would say, well, you can't judge me, and they would use this as just an unqualified command from Jesus, they miss that element of the context. But I also think it's interesting what is said in verse 6. When Jesus says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and don't cast your pearls before swine. How do you know who the dogs are and who the swine are if you are never, under any circumstances, allowed to make a judgment. You see, this very context from which that abused verse is taken from tells us you have to make judgments sometimes. Sometimes in life, we have to make determinations of another person's character. And he talks about this even a little bit later in this chapter. He says in verse 16 about false prophets, you will know them by their fruits. And so when you see the fruit of a person's life, you make a judgment. Is this a good person? Is this an evil person? How do you make that determination? You do that by gauging and judging their fruit. Point being, the context of Matthew 7:1 doesn't allow the interpretation that many people in the world give it. Now, this is just one text in the New Testament that talks about judgment and standards of judgment. And we need to be fair in our judgments. And we need to let our judgments be determined by God's judgments. Our assessments of right and wrong are not subjective standards or assessments. They're based upon things that God has revealed in His Word. He is the objective standard. The Bible is the objective standard which He has given to us. And that is what we base our judgments on. We need to show mercy. We need to show lenience with people. This was one of the things that Jesus criticized others for sometimes, the Pharisees in particular. They would have impossible standards which they themselves had created. And there's a danger in that, and we need to be mindful of that danger. But this passage, Matthew 7:1, is not saying that never under any circumstance are we to make a judgment about someone's actions and determining if those are right or wrong. If God says something is right, then it's right. If God says something is wrong, then it's wrong. And our standard of judgment needs to align with what God's standard of judgment is. Well, let's continue reading. Verse 7. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask Him? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12 is oftentimes referred to as the golden rule. And I'm not going to make much comment about that other than to say a couple of things. First, Jesus says, this is the law and the prophets. I think that's an interesting expression that Jesus uses there. This golden rule is the law and the prophets. I think another way to understand that is Jesus saying, this is the law and the prophets summarized in one sentence. Many of the laws which God gave to Moses to give to the people of Israel were about their relationship to Him. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, for instance. And there were other laws about how they should walk before God and how they should worship God and be in a relationship with God and so forth. But many of the laws also were about how they should treat their fellow man, how they should deal with one another. Love your brother. Love your neighbor. The law said things like that. And so Jesus says the law and the prophets, the teachings of the prophets, which were oftentimes about how you should treat others. And the prophets were talking oftentimes about the poor and the widow and the needy. You should care for them. You should provide for them. Don't treat them unjustly and don't neglect them and so forth. The law and the prophets can be summarized by this golden rule. Here's the second thing I want you to think about relating to the golden rule. I can't think of a single relationship where the golden rule does not apply. In marriage, treat your spouse the way you want to be treated. Parents, treat your children the way you would want to be treated. On the job, in school, whatever relationship we're in, the golden rule is great advice, words to live by, applicable all the time. Verse 13, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. I want to say one thing about that verse 14. The gate is small, the way is narrow that leads to life. There are few who find it. Small, narrow, few. I think sometimes we get the impression that, maybe one day we're going to get to heaven and there's going to be like 9 people there. and we may have that idea because of verse 14. There are few who find it. But I don't want you to have that impression. I take it that there's going to be a lot of people who are basking in the eternal radiance of God's goodness and glory for eternity. There's going to be a lot of people there. A lot of souls will be there. Souls for whom Christ has died, and souls who have been faithful to him throughout their lives, and eternity is their reward. What this means when it says there are few who find it, it's saying in proportion to all of the people who have ever lived on this earth, yes, there may be few who enjoy eternity in paradise with God. But let's not get the impression that we're going to get to heaven and there's just going to be a small number, maybe 15 of us there or something, okay? It's going to be a great homecoming. There's going to be a lot of God's people. Old Testament times, New Testament times, and even modern times as well. I want to skip on down, and I want to go to verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. The way Jesus ends this sermon is a very powerful conclusion to the sermon. I know we sing the kids' song, "The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down," and maybe we think about it as a children's song, but it's a wonderful conclusion to this grand sermon which he has preached. There are those who, Jesus says, will hear my words, but they won't do them. They won't obey them. And they will find that they have built their house, their life, on a very shaky foundation. But those who hear my words and they do them, they have built their lives on a solid rock. And so he is leaving his audience here at the end of the sermon with a very simple choice. You can hear my words and do them and be blessed, or you can hear my words, disregard them, and you will not be blessed. But what Jesus says here as he ends this sermon is directly related to what he has already said before and to how the chapter ends in the following verses. Look at verse 28. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Do you see how that relates to the conclusion that we just read beginning in verse 24? Do you see how it relates to what Jesus said in chapter 5? When he said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, But I say to you, you hear the authority in that. And as Jesus was preaching, I say to you, the crowds heard that, and they recognized he is teaching with authority. He is not, as our scribes do, saying, well, this is what the law says. The scribes would say, well, the law and our traditions say, this is what someone a long, long time ago said. I say to you. You hear the difference in that? The people sure did. They heard that difference. They heard that contrast in that series of teachings in chapter 5. And here, in the conclusion of chapter 7, they hear the authority of Jesus again. If you hear my words and you do them, then your house will stand. If you hear my words and you don't do them, then your house will fall. Thanks for reading with me today. God bless you.